Thank you, Cathaoirleach, and I'll keep it brief because I'm aware that another centre wants to get in and the time is short. Minister, I welcome you to the House, and I also welcome your commitment to the deposit protection scheme. Given that more than 30 million has been paid by the Department of Social Protection in rent deposits for social welfare recipients between 2006 and 2012. And as we all know, as social welfare officers, as they were community welfare officers, had the discretion to help people in exceptional needs, and in that came the deposit for rental accommodation. And usually it was in the region of, well, probably between 500 and 1,000, and sometimes even higher than that amount. And although deposits should be refunded at the end of the tenancy, none of the money has been returned to the Department of Social Protection. And the Department of Social Protection doesn't know whether it's being withheld by the landlord or by the tenant. Now, obviously, tenants move on to new accommodation and they need a deposit again to put down on their new accommodation. That's understandable. But if the tenants are going into accommodation whereby they don't need the deposit, maybe they go back home, maybe they get married and move in with a partner, or maybe they leave the country, well, that money should be returned to the Department of Social Protection, and sometimes it hasn't been. And however, given that 50% of the tenants bringing disputes to the PRTB are rent supplement tenants, and almost 3/4, 72% of disputes relate to deposits, it is clear that some landlords are profiting from retaining the state monies. And the state just cannot continue to waste such resources, the money could be used to help other people who need a deposit. The introduction of a deposit protection scheme would ensure that deposit monies would be returned to the state at the end of the tenancy. It would also ensure that deposit monies will only be paid to landlords who had proven a legitimate claim to the money, either because the tenant is in rent or utility arrears or because they have caused damage to the property. Now, I know, Minister, that you are considering a range of options from the research team in Deccan, but an arrangement which should be made for the Department of Social Protection would be that they wouldn't have to lodge the money with the that the money will be available should the landlord have a legitimate claim. This would could be effectively done by a bond, just as the developers do when they're developing an estate. They lodge an insurance bond, and the department could do that, which would mean that they would have the use of the money during that period rather than the landlord having the use of the money. And the landlord would have the security of knowing that if things go wrong with his tenants, that the backup would be there in the form of the bond. So I would ask you to maybe consider that for the Department of Social Protection, because, as you know, we need the money and we need it circulating in the country and not sitting in a landlord's bank account for that period of time. Minister, I could speak all day on the housing issues. Having been a county councillor as well, I know the issues that are affecting people. But one of the things I would like just to ask you, the affordable housing scheme, that was a great scheme to get people in, get their own private rented accommodation, and it's closed now, but at the moment the banks are now approving mortgages again. So I was just wondering if you would consider the reintroduction of the affordable housing scheme. In Killarney, I know for a fact that 4 houses under the affordable housing scheme could not be allocated to people because they couldn't get the mortgage back in those days. And those 4 houses are still sitting empty, and I think it's 2 or 3 years they've been sitting empty, and either they be transferred into social housing or reopen the affordable housing scheme. But for God's sake, give out the houses. People are crying out for houses and they're sitting there. And one other thing, and I'll finish then. I know of a young man who left home and moved into a flat, and he wouldn't get his rent supplement, I presume. This is more for Department of Social Protection. But because he had to get a letter from the Gardaí to say he couldn't live at home. I think that's terrible to ask any young person to go and get a letter from the Gardaí to say that he couldn't live at home and that there was trouble in the house. So I could speak for the DNA, but I know there's another centre wishing to come in. So I would ask you to take on board those suggestions, Minister, and thank you very much.